So before we move on to the second part of the workshop, we thought we'd give you a little bit of background on why data deception and design. So here is a data visualization that was published. Oh, yes, yeah, feel free to turn your chairs around, absolutely. So this was a data visualization that was published in about 2014 by Simon Carr in the South China Morning Post. And when it was published, this visualization was sort of received a lot of acclaim because of, and it was awarded a lot of sort of high prestigious awards because of how evocative it was about the number of civilian deaths during the Iraq War. And you know, I really like to sort of zoom in to get a full effect of this visualization. So the way it's drawn, the x-axis along the top, you know, is plotting out the months and years. And actually, the y-axis descends down. You know, it's counting up while descending down to depict the number of deaths that occurred in this time period. So along the top, we've basically got, you know, in dark red, the deaths of, you know, people in the army and service people and folks like that. And in the lighter red, the number of civilian deaths. And what is really sort of gripping about this visualization is just this trough of deaths that occurred. And you'll notice that the visualization designer did a really incredible job, you know, taking what is essentially a bar chart, but by inverting that y-axis and applying, you know, these little rounded edges to the bars, makes it look like, you know, the effect of dripping blood, right? Iraq's bloody toll. And that was one of the major reasons that this visualization, again, was so widely praised and received so many awards. But it's really curious because, you know, a more standard bar chart wouldn't have the number sort of increasing going down, right? A more standard bar chart would look something like this, where the numbers count up as you go up along the y-axis. And so I could take the exact same chart and just flip it along the y-axis, on the x-axis, right, and have the bars going up. And I could also pick a slightly more neutral color, this blue instead of the red. And I would argue that the way your eyes look at the visualization on the right-hand side is very different than the way your eyes look at the visualization on the left, right? On the left, what's catching your eye is that huge drop, right, the bloody toll. Here, on the other hand, I would argue that what your eyes probably get to first is the peak of deaths, but then, wow, you know, this remarkable drop-off in the number of deaths. And so probably the takeaway that you're leaving with on the right-hand side is, oh, the situation in Iraq is improving, right? Versus on the left-hand side, wow, it was just really, really bad, right? How many civilians have we lost in this war? And so there's something really interesting happening at the aesthetic level here in the sort of story that the visualization is telling. And what's curious is that several years after the Iraq Bloody Toll visualization was published, a reporter at Reuters tried to replicate the same design to report out about Florida's Stand Your Gun law associated with the Trayvon Martin killing. And you'll notice, you know, very same effects, right? Descending y-axis, the use of red to indicate blood. But the visualization on the right-hand side, whereas the left-hand side was really praised, the right-hand side visualization, same visual, you know, design aesthetics and things like that, was widely criticized as being misleading. Why is that? Right? Why is it the fact that the one on the right-hand side was misleading, whereas the one on the left-hand side was praised? Well, there are a couple of differences in the way these visualizations are designed. First of all, the one on the right-hand side puts the x-axis down here at the bottom, and it also uses a line, right, a thick black line and points to indicate you know, the numbers of deaths that have been caused by guns in Florida. And as a result, I think the way you actually read the visualization on the right-hand side is like a line chart, right? You're looking at the x-axis, and then you're seeing, your eyes are tracing the line, and so you're thinking that, oh, deaths are going up, and then they're coming down, and then, wow, when Florida enacted, you know, stand your ground, gun deaths dropped, when actually it was the other way around, right? And so just at the sort of aesthetic level, it's really interesting to see how visualizations can start to mislead. And I think oftentimes when we think about misleading visualizations, we tend to think about, you know, the sort of like canonical bad actor charts like these. So the chart on the left-hand side was shown at a hearing about abortion, you know, in 2011, and the numbers are just totally skewed. Right? So the number of screening prevention services is 900,000, and yet appears below, you know, the number of abortions, which is about 300,000. Here we've got a chart of climate change showing essentially a flat rate, and the reason it's a flat rate is because the y-axis starts at 0 degrees, right? Not a really meaningless, not a meaningful place to start. And then here both, you know, Fox News and the Rachel Maddow show have bar charts that don't start, ironically, at 0. And so as a result, it makes it seem as though, you know, the Bush tax cut expiring would massively increase the top tax rate, and that, you know, Obama massively decreased the budget deficit when, in fact, you know, it's not as dramatic as it seems. Now, these are absolutely a class of visualizations that, you know, are worth studying and thinking about how we mitigate, but these sorts of errors are so egregious that for the most part, you know, a reader with some amount of sophistication can tell something is going on, right? They're relatively easy to debunk, and almost all 4 of these charts have been widely debunked by journalists. What's more troubling for us is charts that look like this. So these are 3 charts that we collected as part of a study during the height of the pandemic that were massively distributed on social media, on Twitter, on Facebook. And what you'll notice is that in all 3 cases, so, you know, cast your minds back to the summer of 2020, right? We were all locked down. We were all worried, or most of us were worried about the state of the pandemic. And in all 3 cases, these visualizations are showing a seemingly steep decline in cases or deaths or what have you, and the arguments associated with them are suggesting, great, we can lift lockdown restrictions, right? We don't need to mask anymore. You know, yes, the pandemic is still a thing, but it's not as bad as it seems. And if we look at these visualizations, they don't seem as egregiously misleading or, you know, incorrect or things like that, right? The one on the left-hand side, for instance, you know, is highly annotated. And annotation is often one of the things that journalists spend a lot of their time really focused on. So Amanda Cox, who until recently was the chief data officer at the New York Times, has said that the annotation layer is something she believes is the most important part of visualization design. And so the chart on the left-hand side, you know, is probably exemplary in how well it sort of helps a reader understand these different time periods, what these different lines represent, et cetera. And on the right-hand side, Our World in Data, which produced this chart, is actually a very reputable data source. And so what's happening here is not really a case of incorrect visualization, of misleading visualization, but rather, you know, these folks are contesting the ground truth, if you will, right? They're contesting what was at the time the mainstream orthodox point of view that, you know, although cases are declining or deaths are declining, it's not yet safe for us to lift lockdown restrictions. And, you know, we don't yet know as a sort of community how to have these sort of contested conversations when it comes to data. And I should note that the things that people were arguing about were not purely, you know, concerns about visualization aesthetics. So early in the pandemic, you know, as we were trying to figure out what was going on, a number of journalists decided to measure this idea of excess deaths, right? There's a sort of assumption of a baseline number of deaths happening for all the sort of, you know, normal, if you will, reasons, and how many additional deaths that seemed anomalous and potentially attributable to COVID-19. And in a number of Facebook groups that we were studying, people were having really rich conversations about, well, how can we count excess deaths, right? Like, what is this metric that seems to have been invented from whole cloth, seemingly for ideological purposes of keeping people locked down? And some of these arguments actually got pretty sophisticated because people were thinking through essentially causal chains, right? They were thinking about the fact that, well, if you're counting excess deaths, how can you be so sure that those excess deaths are actually purely as a result of the disease of COVID-19 rather than some of the mitigation strategies we've taken? Maybe people are dying because they're isolated, right? They're clinically depressed. They're not actually going to seek medical care for other sorts of ailments that they might have otherwise gone to treat. And so people were actually engaging with data in a very, very sophisticated way and just ending up with different conclusions to the mainstream. Another example of how data was being contested in these groups, right? So these are a set of charts from the COVID-19 tracking project, which was basically set up because at the time, various state and local governments just either didn't have the capacity to be doing a good job counting deaths and cases, or there were a lot of concerns of political interference with these counting activities. So the COVID tracking project, was a sort of grassroots movement to try and offer a more sort of like objective or neutral, tabulation of this data. And at the same time, that same sort of grassroots sort of data analysis was reflected in these groups that were slightly more skeptical about what was happening. So for instance, people were, again, questioning whether counting cases was a fair thing to do, because as the pandemic progressed, we got better at counting cases, right? There were more test kits available. There were more requirements on when you should test, like going to the dentist. If you wanted to go to the dentist partway through the pandemic, the only way you could do that is by getting tested. And so a lot of these folks were wondering whether, the spike in the number of cases is not actually just an artifact of the way that the mitigation strategies have been proceeding. And maybe it's actually a positive that cases are going up because we're getting better at counting them. And so people were equally expressing their frustration that there wasn't good communication around these ideas, right? That they were being forced to sort of figure out for themselves what the right thing is to do. And essentially, what was happening in the pandemic, and we've been studying a number of other case studies with, particularly in the personal health domain, there's this interesting cocktail, essentially. The interplay between authority, whether that is institutional, scientific, policy, mainstream authority, or the authority that people have themselves, the sense of independence that they want to be able to do their own research, come up with their own, conclusions and things like that. At the same time, this idea of certitude, the fact that mainstream policymakers, science communicators, et cetera, particularly early on in the pandemic, felt that they had to seem certain, right? That the only way to galvanize large-scale public sort of behavioral change was to say, we have to mask up because masks are going to save us. And had to express, such certainty. And of course, we've already seen aesthetics and rhetoric. And I think a really nice expression of how complicated sort of the interplay of these four things is how many of you have heard of Edward Tufte or have been to one of his courses? Right, like very well-known data visualization practitioner. Edward Tufte has coined this idea of a data-ink ratio. What the data-ink ratio is basically how much of your data visualization are you using to actually communicate about the data, and how much of your visualization is basically other visual embellishments, right? Whether that is your 3D-ness in your bar chart, your graphics that you've added just for sort of memorability or aesthetics. Another way to think about it is, how much of your graphic is devoted to elements that aren't really essential for the person to, walk away with whatever the takeaway should be. And at its extreme, Tufte almost often recommends, basically successively erasing aspects of your chart until all you're left with is like the platonic ideal of your data, right? And a great demonstration of this was produced by this company, Dark Horse Analytics. This is actually part of a GIF, but in the interest of time, I've just skipped over it, and I'm showing you, what if you used Microsoft Excel and produced the chart on the left-hand side, and Tufte would wag his finger at you, right? He'd be like, get rid of the background, get rid of the shadows, get rid of the bezels, and you'd essentially end up at the, maybe not platonic ideal, but the Tuftean ideal of the chart, which is on the right-hand side. And I would argue that if you look at these two charts side by side, already in your heads, you're probably coming to some conclusions about how seriously you should take the data, how probably proficient, professional, qualified the person who made these visualizations was, right? You're making all of these what we're calling social readings of the visualization. On the left-hand side, you're probably thinking, wow, this was some high school project, right? Or someone just created this as a joke. Like, how can I take straw background seriously, right? But the same data on the right-hand side, wow, it's now so minimalist, right? This looks really precise. It's speaking almost authoritatively because all the bars are gray except bacon. And we all know that bacon is the bar to focus on, right? And so I'll just conclude with the fact that when we published our paper, it got a massive response that was both positive, and the folks who we were actually sort of studying, if you will, sort of had a lot of cognitive dissonance about what the paper was talking about. They couldn't figure out whether we were celebrating them, whether we were critiquing them, what the sort of diagnosis was supposed to be. And I think this person, who is actually one of the sort of central nodes in our analysis, he wrote this Substack post that I think captures this cocktail of authority and certitude and aesthetics and rhetoric really well. You know, I've highlighted this passage here. We came to our conclusions because we engaged with the data. And many of us are very good at engaging with data, far better than the public health C team of self-serving scrubs playing at being ready for the big leagues. Public health is not where the top flight thinkers and analysts wind up, and then it goes on. And so I think it's sort of really contingent on us moving forward. You know, a lot of us, I imagine, are proponents of open science, of open data. All of these data sets are now available for the general public to use. And thanks to research like the stuff that my group does, the ability for people to engage in this data analysis and this data visualization, the floor to do that is much lower than it's ever been. And so people are now able to engage in the sorts of analyses that were previously only the purview of experts. And as a result, they think that, you know, they're coming to rigorous, robust conclusions. And how do we sort of bridge that divide?